Today's podcast is with Joanna Croston. Joanna, as well as being the director of the Banff Mountain Film and Book Festival, is also a recently published author. Her book, Mountaineering Women, Climbing Through History, explores the lives of 20 pioneering female climbers. It was a pleasure to sit down with Joanna and discuss some of these stories in more detail, as well as her process for writing the book. I'll add a link in this episode description as to where you can buy it online. Now on to the episode. Thank you very much for sending a copy of the book over.
Yeah, good.
I loved it.
You had a chance to look at it?
I did, yeah. So I'm up to Alison Hargreaves.
Oh, great.
If you can remember in the chapter.
I don't remember the order anymore, but that's good.
Yeah, so it's about 2/3. Yeah.
2/3.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's a really, even just the way you've put it together. It's a really beautiful book.
Yeah, thanks.
Has the novelty of calling yourself an author worn off yet?
Yeah, not really, actually. I'm kind of enjoying it.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like it might be my future, retirement plan to continue to be an author. So no, it hasn't. And I've been a writer for a long time too, right? So I guess those seem like the same thing to me. But this is my first solo project, right? So it's a little different.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Have you already got other book ideas in your brain then?
When I've been doing book events around, people have been asking immediately, when the next one's coming.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's been really actually kind of affirming, nice, just to be recognized like that. And I talk about in my presentation with, when I do book events, I talk about this big list of people that I have and that I wanted to write about everybody, but I couldn't, right? So that kind of prompts this thing of is there a sequel? Should there be volume 2? When are you going to do that? Right? So that's been kind of the sentiment, which has been great actually to get that feedback. But
yeah, I remember when we spoke last, you said that exact thing, that you had to kind of whittle it down to only so many women that could actually fit into the book. Mm-hmm. So it obviously sounds like there are other stories that you'd be happy to.
Yeah, I think so. My original list was about 80 people. And my publisher basically said, you can't really do that. It's too many. You can't get in deep enough with each of them. So let's do 20, right? So that's where we ended up with 20 in the book. So yeah, there's lots of possibility to write about more. And some of these women, they have their own memoir, right? So there's no shortage of content. And some of the folks on that list of 80 that I didn't write about, that's the same situation where there's actually really great stories, tons of information about them. And it's just a matter of assembling it, actually.
So I was going to ask you, where did you get the stories of the women that you decided to write about? How did you find them?
So a lot of them I kind of knew from just being in this world of mountain culture and my work at the Banff Mountain Film Book Festival. So I'd seen these women on stage, or I'd read their books already in advance. And so I had a good sense of a lot of them. Part of the point of that list of 80 women was to create kind of a wish list in a way of who I wanted to learn more about. So, I had kind of access to some of these stories before I started writing, I guess is the best way to describe it. And some of the people I knew actually as well. So that was even better. Knew them personally. So yeah, it was kind of a compilation of who do I know, what stories have I heard before, which ones have I never heard before and would like to learn more about. Mm-hmm. So it was a bit of a mix actually. Yeah.
And see the early ladies, and I mean obviously from the centuries where we don't have memoirs and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. What drew you to them, the ones that you chose specifically?
Yeah, so that's more the women in the introduction are probably fall best into that category, and they have there's some indication of what they did, right? And so it might have been in an Alpine Club journal or something where there was some documentation, or maybe they had personal journals or diaries or something. So those folks, there's some method of recording, but one thing that's not in my book actually, because it would be really hard to do this work, and hopefully someone's up to the task, but indigenous communities or women in Nepal, for example, Sherpa women, people who climb mountains for other reasons that of course it was never documented, it's just part of their daily life. So we have no record of that, right? So for someone to say, I'm the first person on top of something as a climber, actually we don't really know that, right? Like there's a good chance that maybe they are, but so that's kind of an interesting conundrum, right? And how do you find out those stories? So many of them are probably just lost, and we'll just never know. But luckily, some Indigenous communities have this oral legacy of oral history, and so maybe some of those stories are out there and could be discovered through relatives, or who knows. No.
That was something that I'd never considered before. Yeah. I think that was perhaps an introduction when you can introduce the idea of the fact that there probably are women that grew up in the plateaus of these countries where they've probably done quite a lot of book-worthy things. But I never really considered that. Like, I guess it's the same idea as kind of, people say that like Columbus discovered the Americas, and it's not really the case. Like, there's obviously people here doing that before them. And I don't know why I hadn't applied that same logic to the stories. It was actually really cool to kind of realize that. I was like, oh yeah, true, there must be.
I think, some cultures it's unlikely because they had reverence for mountains and they wouldn't climb them out of respect. So, I mean, there's those kind of details that we know about from a Western perspective in various communities. But, but there's lots we don't, right? Like this area, for example, we have here in the Rockies, like there's no real sense of if or which mountains had been climbed previously to Europeans arriving, right? So it's kind of interesting.
And with regards to getting the book written, was that something that you had always wanted to do, and it was a combination of like you had this interest in this history and a passion to write a book and put them together, or how did you?
It's actually my whole the sort of birth of the idea of this book was actually kind of backwards. Like most people would write a book or a manuscript for sure and submit it to a publisher and then, shop it around probably a little bit, and then it would get taken up and would become a thing, right? In my case, I was visiting a publisher. They wanted me to consult on this other project. So basically we had been talking about this other project, and in some ways it wasn't actually feeling quite right, the project we were talking about. And they wanted me to just, it was a bit unclear actually if I was going to be an editor or a contributor. Or, anyway, long story short, my publisher said to me, you know this realm of mountain literature, mountain culture really well. So this project doesn't feel quite right. What's the missing thing that needs to be part of that? A collection of narratives for mountain literature. And I said, well, there's really not very many books about women, especially a collection of stories about women. There's memoirs here and there. There's a couple of really old, outdated books that are a compilation of women's stories, but both written by men. So it felt like this is a pretty unique prospect right now, and also really timely, right? So I think the world is ready for this book, and maybe 50 or 40 years ago they weren't, right? So yeah, that's kind of how it came about, which is interesting because it's kind of backwards. Most people will. So then I got into a situation where my publisher was like, "Oh, will you just write us a couple sample chapters, and then we'll present it to our publishing board, and then we'll move forward," right? So it was a little bit a reverse pattern, but it worked out really well. So.
And did you already have an idea in your head of how you were going to write it? Like, I know this is really simple, but like long form with a pen or like a laptop, or like had you had any idea?
So I did a lot of research long form, I guess, like had a notebook and I did a lot of research, and I did a lot of interviews, mostly remotely through Zoom or video calls. And then I was able to do a couple of in-person interviews, which was really great, like in person here in Canmore, actually. 2 women in the book, Sarah Henneken and Sharon Wood, live here in town. So that was really great. So it was a bit of a compilation, but I wrote the book on a laptop, yeah. But it was, I don't know. I kind of dig when I'm doing research to have a notebook and write things by hand. rather than, I don't know, what people use. I'm pretty old.
Yeah,
So.
no. Yeah, I feel like
Stylus, I guess, and with a tablet or something, but yeah.
I'm the same. I much prefer writing with a pencil. I much prefer a notepad. And if I'm reading also, I love to read. And if I read, I like physical books. Like I obviously can, but I really don't enjoy reading. I can read your book, which I love, but read it on an ebook, and I'm just like, nah.
Yeah.
I don't know why. The digital aspect of it takes away something for me.
Yeah, for sure. As much as I could, I got my hands on hard copies, and I had like crazy sticky notes throughout, right? And I'd write things about in the column margins, and so yeah, I had this kind of pile. My partner was kind of laughing at me, but I have this like huge pile of books with all these sticky notes. And like, how was I ever going to find what I needed? But I'd written these little notes on each of the sticky notes, so I knew what the reference was for. Anyway, so yeah, bit of a, old school, maybe. I don't know if it's old school.
I don't think, I was going to say, like, I wonder if, I've obviously never written a book, but I would wonder if, it always amazes me when I read books. I'm like, how do they, if it's a fictional story. I'm always like, it amazes me how they go from like page 1 to page like 600. But I was wondering if in this aspect, would it be, not to make it sound less difficult, but would it be slightly easier because each woman is an individual story?
It's way easier.
Yeah.
I'll be honest. Yeah. I think I've never written much fiction at all, but, you've got to envision the entire story in advance, right? With fiction, I think. And how are you going to make things come around or whatever you're trying to do? But with this, it was really digestible, right? Like I could take just one and almost like write an article about that person and then move to the next one. There's some like, common threads that are throughout, but really you could view each chapter as its own kind of entity, right? And a lot of the pulling of the stories together is a visual one in this case too, because the publisher's done a really beautiful job of hiring an illustrator, and so there's this consistent feel and approach to each of the climbs and things. So, but yes, I think it's much easier to write. I mean, it's easier for me. Maybe another writer would find fiction easier.
And yeah, you mentioned there with the chapters, like how the illustrator has illustrations, obviously, but like pictures of like, say they climbed a specific mountain, which most are like a climb, a nice climb or whatever. Like I actually did find that really helpful too. I am obviously a visual person, and having, because I think some of the stories were kind of based around like a climb that they did or a trip, and then being able to look at that and be like, when sometimes when you hear about they work, camp 1 and then camp 2 and then came back down, I think in my brain it gets a little bit jumbled sometimes, but yeah, like having that like a picture to look at, it was like really, really helpful.
Yeah, super. For me too. It's really hard to imagine. And these, like one of the stories, Elizabeth Ruvel's story about Nanga Parbat, it's really confusing because she's going up and down and she's like taking a different route up that she's coming down. And so, yeah, visual aid is always actually really handy, I think. And a lot of these mountains, people won't know, right?
No.
Like they may know Everest and they may kind of have a sense of what the normal route on Everest is. But I think for the most part, the book's designed, for climbers, but also for, I think, just a normal person who likes to read about adventure, right? So obviously the maps and the sort of route diagrams are actually, I think, pretty critical, actually.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm trying to imagine what it would be like if you didn't have that visual aid, right?
I mean, that's probably me, honestly. Like, while I climb, I'm like a recreational climber in the sense of like, I'll do it like a handful of times in the year. I'm not in the I wouldn't classify myself as being like a climber in the community with that knowledge. But because obviously where we live and who we hang out with, like I have heard a lot of the names of places like Nanga Parbat or, the other ones kind of escape me just now, but it was like, obviously because a lot, the book is focused around the kind of mountain world, not mountain world, like the kind of mountain climbing world. So therefore it makes sense that they kind of get repeated so often that now that I'm probably like 2/3 of the way through when they're talking about the Karakoram, I'm like, oh, okay, sweet, yeah, Pakistan, I know what that is. Yeah. It's actually quite good to, honestly, as someone who hasn't had the education, the book's actually been really good to piece all those names together and be like, right, okay, cool, this is where.
Yeah, it's a pretty unique enterprise, right? I mean, I think in other sports, like, once something's been done, it's not necessarily something that happens all the time. Like, maybe that's not true, actually. But I feel like climbers are, they rely on actually specific routes on mountains so they can actually ascend it at their own skill level. Like, not everyone's going to a mountain to climb a new route up, right? And I'm just trying to think if that's a unique prospect, like in the sports world. It might be. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
When you were going into, how would you say, so when your expectation of preparing for the research, how do you think that compared to like the reality of actually like getting into the trenches, if you will, and doing it?
That's interesting. One thing I think that made my job maybe easier, what this book is not is like a full comprehensive history of all the women ever in climbing, right? That would have been quite a daunting task, I think. And maybe I would never have started that because it feels like long, 10 years probably. So because I had like a certain word count per chapter, and again, I already sort of said this, but it felt like digestible, right? So I could do, the research I needed to do something that was quite short, really, relatively speaking. Like, let's say there's, 3,000 or 3,500 words per chapter. One of the things that was challenging for me from a research perspective was there's these little text boxes in there that are sort of fun facts or facts about the mountain or maybe the expedition. Like, there's one where there's like a list of all the equipment they brought to Everest and that sort of thing. And those elements were actually harder to sort of pull together than the stories were, which is kind of weird, right? But so I spent a lot of time like thinking about, okay, here's the main story. I've written it. What are the complementary like bits of information, trivia that people might like to read about? And that actually was sometimes more difficult, especially with some of the more obscure mountains, right? Where actually the only thing written about them is maybe that climb that person did. So, did I answer your question though? Or can you repeat it or go back to it?
So it was how you found your expectations of how the research was going to be in comparison to the reality.
Right. So
because on those text boxes, I actually found that really helpful again because, when you were there's like women in it who are, you talk about they go on to do all this other stuff and it's kind of hard to picture what that other stuff is. But there was one of them I know where it like was a page or half a page really, but of like 2000 and
like everything she's ever done.
Yeah. So that again was actually really good to be like, again, visually seeing it. I was like, oh wow, that actually is a lot, as opposed to just reading it. You're like, yeah whatever.
And like a list like that is really hard to put into a sentence or narrative without it just being a list and being interesting, right? So in some ways, like the visual sort of record of that is, maybe it's just captured better. But to answer your question, so about the research and sort of the
expectation versus
the expectation, And so, I don't feel like I had to read like several books for each chapter, right? And so that can be overwhelming too, where you're like, oh, well, there's so much information. How do I condense this? So that's definitely part of the process. That's a little bit daunting, but also, I think after you write a couple chapters, you're like, oh, this is actually super interesting information, but I probably can't include it because I can't expand on it, or, I just don't have enough, time to sort of dive into that as well, right? So you get kind of good at, I think, self-editing really. But yeah, it's hard to condense. Like definitely like my first drafts of the chapters were longer than they should have been. And so then I had to go through this editing process. I had a couple of levels of editing, like one with someone I knew well who helped me, and then also with the publisher and editor at the publishing house. So yeah, I think that's the hardest part actually, is, I think it's really easy to write something and it's way too many words, right? The hardest part is to like hone in, distill it a bit, and actually make it still interesting and provide the reader with enough information that they understand what's going on, right? I think it's really easy to provide too much information. So again, I'm not sure I answered your question.
No, you definitely did, yeah. And I think you definitely did a good job of that, because again, like, you came away from each story with like just enough information to kind of get, not kind of, to get a grasp of the person in the story.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't really think about it, but yeah, I guess, because, you know, there's 20, if you put it in your words, like there's 20 like short articles of each of these women in this book. But I would assume that the research that you would have to have done for these like smaller articles that you published, like you would have had to have read, like where you were saying, you numerous books on each person. Are you a quick reader?
I'm a pretty quick reader.
Are you very quick?
Yeah,
right.
I don't know, I've never timed myself, but I think I could do 50 pages an hour probably.
Okay, right.
So I could get through a 300 page book in half a day.
Wow.
Yeah.
Damn, fair.
But that's part of my work that I do at the festival too. I have to read a lot. So that's a skill. But in some ways that's maybe wasn't as helpful here, because I actually had to focus on the details a little, right? Not that I don't focus when I'm reading quick, but you don't want that to backfire where you miss something because you're just moving quickly through stuff, right? So there could be some really cool little tidbit that you actually really want, but you might pass over by mistake. But I don't know if I did that.
And I would assume that you're making notes as well. It's not like, if I read books, like I'm reading it just for the enjoyment of it, whereas it's very different if I'm reading a book to try and extract information, because I would say I'm more intentional, and 9 times out of 10 I'm stopping, I'm writing, and then I'm getting back into reading it. So it could be, it'd be doubly long, but it could take like a significant. Yeah,
as I said, I was like firing sticky notes in as I was going, and like making little notes as I went to. I was also looking for, because my publisher wanted some good quotes too, right? So I would have to flag that as well as I was going through. Like, this would be a nice kind of pull out quote that we could include. So yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually do that. So after I edit these episodes, I'll listen back to the episode like in full, like numerous times, because you'll catch something in it. But anyway, you also can't skim it. For two reasons. One, for the one that you just mentioned, like I also do like little short videos, so I'm trying to find something that I think is like a good kind of like clip-worthy little bit. So you have to pay attention, and also, say I would listen to it on a walk's really good, but if I was to do it, say on a run or the gym when I'm like kind of not paying attention, there's little like things you would miss, and then I'd hate to actually put something out and then there's like a horrible like screechy noise, and because I've been like running around, I've not actually heard it. But and when you were looking into the stories, or like the women that you were looking into, or the history that you already kind of just had, were there any stories that you found were surprisingly overlooked or like minimized?
Yeah, there's a bunch actually, I would say. There's probably at least half of them, I feel like even climbers may not know those stories. And those I had kind of had to pull out of the climbers directly, right? So when I interviewed them, one of the questions I asked the climbers was, one thing I wanted to focus on was maybe not their most famous climb, especially if it had been, there'd been a lot of attention to it already, right? So Sharon Wood's a great example. She's a Canadian climber in the book. She's the first woman in North America to summit Mount Everest. But that's not the story I chose. I chose a story about a climb she did in South America that she was doing to prepare herself for that big one. Because knowing that a lot of the readers will already know that story of her in Everest, and it's a great story. And she wrote a whole book about it, right? So this was the point of her story, was to like, okay, we already know Sharon. We already know her big sort of hit in the world. What about some of the other stuff? Because then that broadens the depth of stories from women, right? That was my thinking, was like, sure, I can focus on the most popular or the most celebrated or the most written about stories, but actually, wouldn't it be interesting to bring up some stuff that people don't know about, right? And as you suggest, a bunch of these in the book are stories people won't have known about because the climbers never wrote about themselves, or there might be just some reference to their climb in passing in a journal, like an Alpine journal, or an Alpine Club presentation that maybe they did. So they may have talked about what they did, but there's no permanent record of that, really. So that was kind of, was very intentional to bring some lesser known climbers and lesser known climbs to the forefront too, so that people could realize, actually how much has been done that we don't know that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think from what's what I'm looking for, from like the person taking in the information, what's the word? I can't think of it just now.
Like the reader.
The reader, yeah, sorry. Yeah. Person that reads book from the reader's perspective, thank you. Yeah, I think I always find it more interesting when, say, someone, kind of what you're just suggesting there, like someone is already known for doing something. I actually always find it more appealing to learn more as opposed to just learning the same thing.
Yeah.
I guess you do it anywhere, like someone's written a book about it and then someone else writes a book about them and the same kind of story. Like, if you want to get people to read it, like I actually think going for those more, not behind the curtains, maybe not the right term, but stories that people haven't heard, because it's more appealing to, you want to learn more about that person, not just like the thing that they've already done.
Like it enables a bit of curiosity, right, from the reader. There's a couple women that definitely I didn't take that strategy. So Junko Tabe is the first chapter in the book, and she's the first woman to summit Everest. And that was just like a pivotal moment in the history of this genre. So like, to not write about that would have been kind of dumb, actually. But Junko did many other things, right? But I think some things you just have to earmark, and they just set this foundation, right? So her story is one of those. Lynn Hill's story too, her free ascent of the nose and on the nose in Yosemite, also like totally transformational, pivotal moment in the history of women in climbing, actually men or women in her case. So that, those were like, okay, well, I'm not touching those. Like they have to just be what they are. And I tried to pull in little tidbits of other things they did through the chapter, or with those little fun fact text boxes or something. So yeah, I guess, there needed to be a bit of a balance of both of those things. Super well known, celebrated, and totally unknown, right? And one of the climbers in the book, a Japanese climber named Kei Taniguchi, like for sure, probably only known to, like really hardcore alpine climbers. Her name would not be like sort of a household brand, But again, really important to, I think, highlight her. She's no longer with us, sadly. But the climb she was doing and the difficulty of those ascents it's kind of crazy, right? And we should be celebrating that skill level, I think, for man or woman. In her case, she was climbing at a really high level for anybody. But again, nobody knows better, right? And it could have been a cultural thing with her. I think she was, I only met her once, but I didn't really have a chance to really speak with, this is way before the book project. So, but a very modest person, probably not very likely to sort of toot her own horn and like tell the story widely, like probably with her little group of friends, or maybe a climbing club or something she might have, but. So, what happens to those stories if they're not recorded in a book or some other? So I felt really like strongly about that one. And her family too was really grateful, for her to receive what they considered like finally this kind of recognition in the book. And especially to be put alongside Junko Tabe, also from Japan, who was like a national hero. Like she had a whole different kind of experience with climbing at a high level, right? So anyway, so that was kind of an interesting thing that happened. And also, again, a bit of affirmation that including the lesser known stories was relevant and that people would enjoy them too, right?
Yeah, so, definitely. Like extracting those stories that people don't know. And were there any stories that, you were saying there about like perhaps like getting stories about people already well known who had already done things well known? Were there any stories that you're like, without even having to try and like dig deeper and extract, that you were like, I'm surprised that no one's talking about this or heard this? Maybe it sounds like that the second Japanese lady is that.
Well, Kei Taniguchi for sure. Yeah. I think with some of the more popular, more contemporary climbers, like someone like Brett Harrington, she's a very prolific social media person, right? So she's got tons of stuff on her social. She's had films made about her. She's done a little bit of writing, but, people may know her, again, kind of in passing, or know her as a particular style of climbing, but not really understand the depth of her skill set, right? And so I felt like writing a long form piece about her, longer than social, I guess is what I'm trying to say, is important, because you wouldn't get that sort of depth of understanding from reading a story on Instagram, right? So there's a difference in my mind between that and writing an article or even a memoir, right? Like Elizabeth Revol's chapter in here is about Nanga Parbat, and she wrote a whole book on that climb, right? So that's like, again, it was sort of next level even. So I kind of worry in some ways about social media and, all of this being recorded in a digital realm. And maybe that's just me being an older person, but like, what happens to it? Is there going to be so much information that those stories get buried in just like, the digital universe? Whereas, I don't know, so there's something more tangible for me about it's in a book and it can be cataloged and someone can research it that way. I don't know. We could talk about AI for hours, but, that kind of plays into it too, I think, in my mind.
In what way?
Well, I've just been to an AI conference, so it's on top of mind. But right. But like this idea that stories. Well, what we were talking about at this conference was like actually kind of a theft of information, and how unregulated it is right now, which is about to change, I think, in Canada, hopefully. But so I mean, you could decide to look up Brett Harrington, the climber in my book, and use AI, and maybe get kind of a shell or a summary of information about her. But you may not know the detail of a specific climb because it hasn't been fed into AI, because there's no book or whatever. So I don't know. It kind of concerns me a little bit. But I also think there's a lot of really great stuff that AI can be used for. I just think it's a bit of a like Wild West right now.
Yeah.
So.
And I guess with the social media side of things, I mean, most people, I don't know Brett, so I'm not speaking about her specifically, but I feel like, social media has a general bias towards like positivity, in the sense of, you're usually showing the best side of the things. Sure. And I know not everyone does that. Like a lot of people will post like they had a terrible climb or a terrible whatever experience. Whereas, reading something that has been written by, say, someone like yourself, which is like a different, unbiased, hopefully, perspective on that story. I think they definitely are two different things. And for me, anyway, the way that I only have social media for this podcast, so I hopefully don't go on it a lot, but the way you digest it is totally different. Like, guys, when I've been reading your book, like, I'm like sitting in silence reading it, I feel like really like intentionally doing it. Whereas if I could go on Brett's Instagram and scroll through it, and I don't think I would retain anything really.
It's a different experience, right?
Yeah.
You get you have to commit a bit of like focus time. You have to find time, right? I mean, it's a little different. You're not filling time maybe as you would with your phone. Like if you're 5 minutes early for a meeting, you might quickly scroll through, right? But with a book, I think it's just more intentional, as you said. You're more intentional about it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I would definitely say, even though I still fall into the trap of scrolling, and I would say exactly what you said there, where like when I go on social media, it's usually to kill time. It's not to like be intentional about it. Whereas, when I'm sitting down with a book, I'm like usually saying to my girlfriend, like, hey, I'm like going in this room, like, don't come in here. Or like, if you do come in, please put headphones in. But, and with the stories that you were trying to highlight, were there any that surprised you? Like in an inspiring way, or like even like a shocking way that...
Yeah, I think there's a bunch actually that surprised me. Maybe more what surprised me was like, how did the person get to that point? Or, what was it in the background of their history that I didn't know about that allowed them to do that climb? That, I think, was a quite a rewarding experience of discovery, you know? So, like I said earlier, some of these stories I knew quite well, or I knew the general premise of the story, but finding out, maybe the childhood of that person, or the first climbs they did, and like who were their mentors was a big one. And then, and then the story itself, and then also maybe the aftermath was interesting sometimes. There's a story in the book about a New Zealand climber named Lydia Brady, and I knew her general story. So that, in short, she was the first woman to summit Mount Everest without supplemental oxygen, but nobody believed her. Like her climbing, you haven't got to that one. It might be the last chapter.
Oh, right, okay, yeah. How was that one? No.
So she went with a team of climbers, and there was some group dynamics that didn't work well in her favor. She was young and had a lot of energy, and this was an older kind of group of experienced male climbers. Anyway, all that to say, she ended up summiting alone, and they didn't believe she did it. And they started to spread rumors about her in the climbing community that this was all a falsehood, right?
Wow.
And I knew this general story, and it took years for her to be vindicated, right? And for it to be proven that she had actually done this. And, but what I had never thought about, and I knew this whole story in advance, and I'd read Lydia's book, which goes into it in quite a lot of depth. But what I didn't fully grasp until I interviewed her in person was the aftermath and the repercussions of that whole story on how she led her life following that experience, right? So, I mean, for years, she was sort of wrought with doubt about her self-confidence and like all the things that you wouldn't necessarily put out into the world, right? And she eventually became, kind of a national hero in New Zealand, but it was decades after this thing, right? And how interesting that is, that had it been in the moment, and had she had been celebrated when she had come home from the climb right away, like she would have had a different life, right? So she ended up, being a bit more reclusive. Well, not a bit more, a lot more reclusive, especially in sort of public circles. And she took this path of becoming a climbing guide because she didn't want to give up the mountains at all. She wanted to stay with it. But, it's just sort of fascinating to think about what would have happened if, right? So...
Yeah, yeah, it would totally shape your life. Like, I mean, when you were just saying that, I was thinking about how, like, if people did that to me, you were obviously saying that she started self-doubting herself, but you're also like, not all, but your trust in other people would also be, I feel like that would be tarnished as well, because like if I was with a group of people and we did something and then they told everyone I didn't do it, I'd be like, it would definitely... Yeah. I mean, I've had just personal experience in the past of the way that I've been treated in certain circumstances by certain people. And at the age of 32 now, still, I actively have to think to myself, like, let that go. Like, not everyone's going to do that.
So imagine that's like blown into a huge media circus, right? Which is what happened with Lydia. Imagine how that would affect you, right? And so she's a fascinating person. And I met her here in Kenmore, actually. She happened to be here. So she's a guide, and she was doing some guiding in BC. And she'd agreed to be part of the book long before, but she said, I'm going to come see you. And she invited herself to stay at my house, actually, which was fine. It was great. But, so we had this really good, like a really nice amount of time to sort of settle in and talk about a lot of things. And she's a bit, over that story. Like she doesn't mind other people telling it, and she doesn't mind sort of answering questions about it. But I think she's lived that so long that she's now like, okay, here's, where I am now. And so we talked a lot about that. And I think specifically she's been mentoring younger women climbers in New Zealand, and specifically trying to train them to get ready for big expeditions on Himalayan peaks. And, she feels really strongly about that. And I think that's formed her into this person, that experience she had, so that she can make sure that doesn't happen to other people, right? That's kind of, I think, she may not actually describe it exactly that way, but it feels to me like that's the silver lining of the whole thing, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess as you get older, you just stop caring as well what people think.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
She's definitely one of those people.
Yeah.
But anyway, so that was your question was about like what were the surprising stories in the book. I think one thing that was surprising to me was like this common thread that I found when I was interviewing people, which was when I asked people to be part of the project and asked them if they would be willing to allow me to tell their story. So many of the women in the book, their reaction was like, oh my God, why me? Like, I don't think I'm worthy to be represented with these other, like I would give them examples of other women who were in the book. Like, let's say Lynn Hill, who's quite famous and celebrated. And I would say, here's some other people that are going to be in the book. And they'd be like, oh my God, like I am not at that level. Like, this is crazy. You should,
Who are you?
And I would be like, well, no, like actually your story is actually really important, first of all, but also like as significant and maybe hasn't received as much attention, but certainly like not outlandish that it should be in the book, right? So that was really interesting to me. That people were, quite humble. And I wouldn't say they were reluctant, like definitely they were honored and they were humbled by the fact that they would be in it. And I guess I wasn't expecting that, especially with some of the people who were actually more popular, I was like, wow, like, you've had some recognition. However, you still think that whatever you've done is not as big as what Lynn Hill did. So that was, and it kept happening. So.
It's quite I wonder if there's the fact that you have somehow been attracted to women who, and like as it turns out, have been very humble. Well,
I talk about that quite a bit usually with the audiences when I'm doing my book talk. They want to know, I say that to them about this common thread, and they want to know why. And I don't know if it's a gender thing. I think maybe it is. I think historically, certainly in the last couple of centuries, women were definitely probably discouraged from boasting, let's call it, right? Or being really sort of outwardly, what's the right word? I don't know. I guess, you that's just not ladylike, right? Like you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't say, oh, I've done this and I'm the first person and aren't I great? Like you just wouldn't do that. So I think there's that sort of socio sort of upbringing that, would lend itself to that sort of pattern. But I think with the younger women in my book, that's less of a thing, right? Again, with social media or with, and social media is like kind of inherently narcissistic, I think, in a little way, right? It's all about, look at me. Here's how much fun I'm having, right? So, or as you mentioned, maybe, it's too much that way, like
I totally agree with you,
positivity standpoint, like false positivity, actually. So yeah, I don't know. I guess it's a gender thing, but I feel like, there's probably just as many men who are humble and modest and whose stories aren't out there too. But the way the mountaineering world is and the way the mountain literature world is, it's undeniable that there's more stories about men and there's more kind of a celebration of things that they have done versus women. And that could just be a simple, mathematical calculation of like how many more men have climbed than women have climbed. But there's definitely kind of a bias, even now, in 2026, you'll find more stories from men, probably. So yeah.
And why do you think these women decided to climb if they either grew up in an era or a society that did discourage them? Like, what do you think made them do it anyway?
Well, I think most of them are mavericks in a way, Gwen Moffat's a great example in my book. She was, you probably enjoyed that chapter.
Yeah, I did, yeah.
She's pretty cool. She's still alive. She's 101.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. It's pretty amazing. I have a funny story about sending her my chapter, actually. Maybe I'll come back to that. So, she was definitely, a bit of a social deviant, if you will, right? I think, climbers for a long time there was this sort of gentlemanly era of climbing and, being sort of a sporting gentleman. And that was more in the 19th century. But then it became like a bit of a dirtbag culture, right? In the 50s, 60s, particularly with rock climbing. And Gwen, I think, kind of was at the very beginning of that. So she would have been climbing in the 40s, 50s, 60s, right? But she kind of, I think, latched onto that culture of, it's not, antisocial is too strong of a word, but like non-conventional, right? Unconventional lifestyles. She deserted the army to become a climber. She was a single mom. She was, for a lot of her life, she didn't own a home, right? So she would, go from sort of climbing hut to climbing hut, living this lifestyle and very pretty avant-garde for someone in that age. And even now, like, she only just bought a house when she was 70, right? Her first house. And, was it 70 or 80? It might have even been 80 when she bought her first house. Anyway, she, finally realized the luxury of like having a laundry machine at home and like all the things, right, that we would take for granted. But, anyway, what I was going to tell you about, so I sent her the chapter, and she's written a beautiful memoir called Space Below My Feet. And again, kind of a bit of a Maverick move because I can't remember the exact year it was published, but it was early on, in the 20th century. Like, and so she was a bit of an anomaly. She wrote this book and it actually did really well too. She went on to become a writer. She wrote like dozens and dozens of books, like crime fiction, not climbing. Yeah. So it's pretty interesting. Anyway, when I sent her the chapter, she, she's a bit of a, I don't know, email can be kind of weird, but her responses to me were quite terse, right? Like she was quite, she's like very, forthcoming with like any factual errors I made, like this is incorrect, this is, which was great. But I'd written the whole chapter using her first name. I was calling her Gwen through the whole chapter. And one of her comments was, like, for God's sake, like, to call me Moffat. Like, nobody calls me Gwen. Just call me Moffat, and then it was this kind of really terse kind of response to this email I sent her. Anyway, it was quite funny. But she's actually, a lovely person, too.
Yeah, I don't know if that's a UKism because most people I know go by their last name or nick.
Yeah, I maybe it is, right? But it's it was this sort of, maybe this cultural reaction I wasn't aware of. But,
and also the UK, I would say, is quite a forthcoming, or not forthcoming, is a very forward, I would say, not everyone, obviously, but I would say most people will just tell you
how they feel. Agreed. Canada's much more polite, I think, in that regard, or maybe it's not politeness at all. Maybe it's just like, whatever. But, yes. So it was actually pretty fun to work with her on that chapter. Yeah, and I don't know. She's amazing. What she did in that era, when really, so many women were just at home being housewives, right? And that was what you're supposed to do. So, yeah.
And I think in the eras even before Gwen, it was quite, and I don't mean this in a disparaging way, but I always find it quite funny when you see like the really old pictures of like mountaineering. And I mean this for both men and women, like their outfits.
Yeah.
I think with the women it's more prominent because they're like skirts in the mountains, whereas the guys equally are wearing like, tweed three-piece not tuxes. So I always find that, when I look back on those pictures of those ladies, I think it just perhaps sticks out to me more that even in the mountains, like there was still this, as you were kind of saying earlier, like this weird, like ladylike, you had to be.
Well, you had to have a lot of money back then, right?
Yeah, true, yeah.
You had to have time for leisure. and you had to have the means to get to these mountain places and to hire guides, right? Because that's really how you did it. So in some ways, Gwen, she might be the first kind of real dirtbag committed to the cause climber for women. Like I haven't done the research, but it's quite possible like people before her would have been from very affluent families. There's a very famous family that traveled to Canada from the eastern seaboard of the U.S. to the Rockies here called the Vaux family. And there's photos of them on, Rogers Pass and the glaciers around here. And you can tell they have money, and they would have spent the whole summer here, right? And that was not a cheap enterprise, right? So some of the women in the early pages of the book, like, are definitely like women from society, right? And that would have actually afforded them the luxury to actually step out a little bit too, I think, especially if they had the support of their husbands, which most of them did, or their brothers maybe. But there had to be some sort of approval for sure for them to be able to do what they're doing. I think they're, now it's different kind of, I think it's still a very privileged, let's call it a sport. People would argue that it's not, but for simplicity.
Yeah.
You don't see tons of women of color, Indigenous people climbing more and more, I would say, but still a very feels still, you have to buy a lot of equipment. It's expensive. It can be expensive, right? It's a little different than being a runner, maybe, where all you need is a good trail and some good shoes, right?
And also the access to it as well.
Yeah.
You need access to
Yeah, right. Like, we both know how expensive it is to just live here. If you want to live this lifestyle, you have to have a certain commitment to either working a lot or maybe you have a trust fund.
Yeah.
Right. So, yeah.
Well, even in Scotland, before coming here, a big part of coming to Canada was because I was spending all my weekends in the Highlands, and I was like, where's an equivalent place? But even then, Scotland's a very small place, so it's not really that far, but I lived south of Glasgow, so it was probably like an hour and a half, and then I was in the foot of the Highlands, if you will. But I had to have a car, I had to drive there, even just in that, it was still, I had to own a car to get there.
Yep.
If someone is living in a city and they have a low income job and they can't afford a car, can't get a train to these places, can't get a bus.
It's the same here, really, right?
Yeah.
There's if you lived in Canmore and you wanted to just be a rock climber, you could probably get to a bunch of crags on your bike and it'd be okay. But if you wanted to go deeper into the hills, definitely you need to have a car and friends.
And I was going to say in friends as well, because often, most of the things I've got into, not most of it, but I would say a good portion of the things I've got into in life is because someone has introduced me to it, which is a very normal thing to do. But, if you're living in a place where, you live in a city centre in any kind of major country, it's probably rare that someone's going to be like, oh, hey, do you want to go out climbing in any capacity that's not just indoors?
Shima Shirashi, in the back of my book, she wrote the afterword. So that's her jam, right? She grew up in New York City, learned to climb on one of the boulders in Central Park, but her whole shtick is getting urban kids out of the city and hopefully getting them climbing or getting them to experience nature in a different way, because some of them haven't experienced it at all. They may not have ever seen the real night sky from living in the city. They may not have ever been, in a boat down a river, right? Very kind of simple things that we maybe take for granted. Climbing a tree, even maybe, I don't know. But that's her. Her sort of passion project now. She runs a really great organization, and she's shifted. She became quite famous quite young, really as a child. And so now in her 20s, she's sort of really finding her purpose, I think, using her climbing for this purpose and this passion project she has. So it's kind of interesting. So she wrote the chapter on what's the future of climbing, right? And so she did a great job. She's a really interesting person.
And when you were piecing together like all these historical narratives of, I mean, even just in this conversation, we've talked through the decades and the
Mm-hmm.
centuries really.
Mm-hmm.
What was the biggest challenge of piecing them all together?
Mm-hmm.
Because the book isn't in chronological order. It's not like the oldest.
No, intentionally not, right?
Okay.
Because again, there's no way I could write a comprehensive history. I mean, maybe I could, but I would need 10 years probably or something. That's a huge project. It's a huge project, right? Yeah. Like if I go back to that list of 80 women and I think, oh, okay, now I'm going to write this book that has all of these women and maybe more in it. That's like the amount of research is quite different. So yeah, intentionally, I decided to pick women from different eras because, well, first of all, I wanted to tell the best stories. That was one thing where it was like, what are the best stories? And so that was kind of a natural filter where it was like, oh yeah, there's, this one from the 80s and 90s and this one from the early 2000s, like you could kind of do a bit of patchwork. But then I also thought about geography. It could easily have been a book of just all Everest all the time, right? Which I didn't want either. So there's some kind of thought to geography. I did really try to include some stories from women of color or indigenous communities too. So there's a Sherpa story in the book, Pasang Lama Sherpa, and then Wasfira Nasreen, who's a Bangladeshi climber. Mm-hmm. And then there's the two Japanese climbers I mentioned earlier. So I try to not just do Western European or North American climbers as well. And yeah, so it was very intentional to try and find that balance. I also wanted to do different types of climbing, right? So rock climbing, high altitude mountaineering and alpine climbing really are the most prominent. But I just mentioned Ashima, and she's a boulderer, right? So there's also bouldering, I guess, in the book too. Maybe less so. But, some of the... And Hazel Finley, who's in my book from the UK, the climb we're talking about in that story that is represented is like a single rope length, right? It's one pitch, but it's insanely difficult, right? And so that's more interesting. It's harder to write, I would say, that than like a 60-day expedition to K2, right? There's more to talk about with the expedition. How do you fill 3,000 words about just 50 meters? It's a different kind of game as a writer. So I kind of like that too. Like as a reader, I think you probably appreciate that. Hopefully you do. That there's a variety of climbing and a variety of styles of approach to the challenge too, right?
I definitely did, yeah.
Yeah, because otherwise you might get a bit bored, if it's sort of like this sort of...
K2.
Yeah, or even a repetition of style. Like a person went here, they got to the top, they came down, right? Like there's got to be more, right? So yeah, so there you go.
Yeah, I definitely had that with one of I think it was the girl, and forgive me for forgetting her name, but she did like the longest like single ice climb. I'm going to totally butcher that. I can't remember her name.
Yeah, like it might be Ines Paber. You're thinking maybe, there's two ice climbers in the book.
That is who it was, yeah.
Ines, she's from Germany.
And that was cool. Like when I started reading her chapter and then looked at the illustration, I was like, this is only 750 meters or whatever it was compared to the one prior that had been, like climbing an 8,000 or something like that. So yeah, I did like that. I liked that it wasn't just big mountain.
Yeah. And sometimes, those, like in some ways, the challenges are different, right? So like to be at a really high rock climbing level or an ice climbing level, may take as much or maybe more physical training than getting to the top of K2, right? So again, trying to create a bit of appreciation for that, even though people's styles of climbing are different, the amount of effort, the amount of training, the amount of like knowledge, research that goes into even just doing maybe that 50 meters or that 700 meters is actually huge, right? And that's probably less obvious to a non-climber, right? And so hopefully in the book, they're like, oh, actually now I get it.
Yeah, I guess with the big mountain ones, as a non-climber, you just see a big mountain.
Yeah.
Whereas if you aren't into rock climbing, you see like a single pitch.
Yeah.
You'd be like, yeah, but
right.
It's not that hard.
But you really have no comprehension of like the difficulty level,
like the skill, the years that you've had to like. You know, because I think even Alex Honnold, when he did his free solo, like I think he's talked about it. It wasn't like a summer activity. It was like years of going and thinking he couldn't do it and forgetting about it.
Totally. And rehearsing it in a way, right? He rehearsed the difficult moves that he knew were coming or whatever. And he also, you know, with that climb, he didn't pick the hardest thing he's ever done at all because he knew that would be kind of stupid. Like he wasn't at his limit. He had to be at a comfort level that made sense. So he had to really know what he was doing. And literally every single move probably. So again, like tons of mental preparation, tons of physical preparation, right?
And with regards to climbing, like how do you think opportunities for women have evolved? And then conversely, like what things do you think haven't changed over the like span of history?
Yeah, you know what opportunities have come up, which I think is really fabulous, is the chance to climb with other women and join workshops or like climbing camps or whatever, or all of women's expeditions, because that I think is a really kind of a pretty, I would say within the last decade, maybe 2 decades, if you know, but that's a kind of a new phenomenon. And I think it has to do with, a lot of things, but probably one of the more practical elements is that, you know, now we're at a place where there's a lot more certified women guides who could lead those programs. Before there would have been just a shortage. And not that they may not have been popular had they been offered, but it would have been more challenging, right, to find people. Even Junko Tabe, her trip to Everest when she first ascended was an all-women's expedition in the 70s, which, you know, if you think about that, that's actually like one of the main obstacles probably of the whole thing was just to get together. And they had quite a lot of people on their team, right? But for her to assemble 10 or 12 climbers in that era who were women who were capable of that would have been difficult. So I think that's a big thing. So women can learn from women. They can climb with women. And there's, you know, it's maybe hard for men to understand, but there's a certain comfort level that happens, you know, if a woman is asking a woman a question, let's say a technical safety question, there's a different kind of just a comfort level. And I think if they were asking a man, they might feel stupid asking that question, or maybe they should know it already, or they might feel like it's irrelevant or not, you know, important. So there's something about that, and it's hard to explain, but there is something there. So that's a big thing. What else has changed? What other opportunities? I think, you know, women, with the advent of indoor climbing too, it's just more accessible. I think that, and that's just generally, the general population is, you know, probably there's very few people now, people your age or people, you know, growing up who have never climbed, and they would have climbed indoors, but that's a huge thing, right? It's great actually. And it's more of maybe it's an accessibility thing again, where it's like, you know, maybe I don't have a car and maybe I can't go climb at the crag, but I could go here to Elevation Place for an afternoon and climb. So that's another really good thing. What hasn't changed, I think, is there's still a bit of a stigma with the achievements of women versus the recognition they get and the achievements of men. So, you know, lots of women have climbed harder things than Alex Honnold, right? But Alex Honnold is Alex Honnold, right? So if you kind of wrap your head around that a little bit and you go, oh, actually, that's weird, right? Why is that? And I don't, you know, none of the book and none of the sort of conversation we're having is like meant to, you know, surmount achievements of men at all. I just think there's just been this tradition and this legacy piece that we're still kind of working through. But yeah, so, you know, what hasn't changed, I think, is, you know, on a real practical level, I think, when a climber is sponsored, for example, a woman will make less than a man. Again, even if they're climbing hard. And there'll just be less women probably on a outdoor brand, like a clothing brand. If they have a roster of ambassadors, there'll just be less women. So some things, I think we're getting there, like baby steps in some of the regards, but, when I've been, and this is maybe no surprise, but when I've been doing my book events, it's mostly women in the crowd. But what I've been really inspired by is the number of young women who are there and who are in a very supportive, it feels like they're in a very supportive environment and a community, and they're climbers and they're creating their own little support kind of group, which is cool. And I don't mean like mental support. I just mean they support each other, they encourage each other. There's this kind of really nice community. And I never had that when I was learning to climb. I climbed mostly with men, which was great. And I had a really good climbing community of men, and they were all very supportive. But, just different times, right?
Yeah, it's different. And not to compare, when you were saying that, I was kind of thinking of my experience. I mean, as a guy, but, I find it different when I talk to someone from where I'm from than people here. Like, just because, like, especially, I'm now probably being specific to where I'm exactly from, because there's a different understanding of, like, culture and places that I can talk about that they'll understand. And, I could have the same conversation with someone here, but they wouldn't get it, quote unquote. And I don't know if I mean, not to compare it, but when you were saying that, I was like, it kind of sounds similar, where, like, yes, a woman could have a conversation with a guy, but he's not going to understand it because he isn't a woman who's had to, doesn't have the experiences that women have.
Yeah. I think, women still are overcoming lots of obstacles just in life in general, right? And so we're getting there, but there's no equity yet. Yeah. So.
And it sounds like perhaps the biggest gaps is that, I mean, you kind of made the example of like the roster of ambassador athletes at like a company, and like is still probably more skewed towards men. It sounds like those are maybe the biggest gaps are still in that kind of,
yeah, I would say. And then also just like recognition generally, even for a non-sponsored climber, like, and I don't have any data on this. This would just be anecdotal, but I would wager that, a woman's story would receive less attention than a man's, right? There's been some really, maybe this is getting off topic a little too much, but there's been some really interesting, and you can find articles about this, but really interesting, like, again, related to social media, but like, if a woman who's a climber, posts pictures of herself more scantily clad, she'll get more followers, right? And there's that kind of like whole mindset. And so are they taken seriously, or is it just because of this, how they look, right? Probably the same can be said of a guy who's, in really good shape and has his shirt off all the time. Probably there's that kind of thing. But, there's still kind of those social barriers we're talking about.
Yeah, I always find it, again, this is a bit off topic, but I actually find it quite surprising. Shocking's maybe not the right word, but I honestly still find it really surprising where I'll be scrolling and there'll be like a video of, and the one that apparently it must be a trend, right? It's like a girl, like she's putting like her top on, but it's like her back, so like she's naked but from behind. But the video is like, she's going, I don't know, like the video, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, it makes sense because that is what they are doing. The algorithm has found that this thing is what guys, I guess, are attracted to. But it just surprises me because the video will then have nothing. They'll be like, I'm going to the zoo, or like something totally unrelated to that. But yeah, it's weird how, I mean, unfortunately that seems to be the thing that catches your attention. And I'm just like, this is kind of bizarre to live in this world.
Or I guess the fact that a woman may have to do that.
Yeah, exactly.
To get attention or to get the same number of followers. But hopefully we're coming, I'd like to think that the world's going a little bit back to analog, and that maybe all this will go away.
I
don't know. I'm deep in it too, right? I've got, like you, I have social media accounts for business and for my book, and it just seems to be the way. But
I think and not to, you aren't old, but you're older than me. So I'm just saying that though, because you also come from, so I'm from like the early 90s. So I'm the generation that were like, there wasn't iPhones when I was like a kid, like, but like by the time I was a teenager, there was iPhones. So like, when I was at school, and I know you'll probably be able to relate to this even more, like if your friend wasn't at school, like you didn't know where they were. You would have to like come home and then go to their house and find out. And,
Right.
I almost feel like I'm constantly in this like internal battle to like go back to that work, like life. Like the amount of times I've said to my girlfriend about how I want to like get rid of my iPhone and buy like a flip phone. And, but then it's just the reality. And I like Spotify. I like being in my car and on Google Maps.
There's some really great stuff, right? And it's hard to sort of separate that.
And with regards to, so you obviously spend like a lot of time going through like a lot of people's history and a lot of like span of history. What do you think are lessons that modern climbers misunderstand about that history?
That's a really good question. I think, one thing that's always been a bit of a enigma is, the reason people climb. And I think if you go back and read a lot of traditional, narratives about some of the early climbs, let's say in the Himalayas, you might get this impression that nothing ever went wrong, or that the climbers writing those narratives never were afraid, or never had, I guess what I'm trying to get at is with more contemporary writers and more contemporary climbing writing, the people actually, truly talk about vulnerability and how vulnerable they feel and how they were terrified, right? Or how this thing, this was like a huge obstacle for them to overcome. Whereas if you're talking about some of the grand expeditions of the early 20th century or something, that stuff gets a bit glossed over in the effort to like celebrate or really like build up and not necessarily falsely, but like romanticize, let's say, the climb, right? So, it's not quite it's kind of a rosy picture, right? And it's maybe not quite so accurate. And you really see that when you're reading it, reading some of the old trip journals and things, you'll be like, oh, it all sounds so great, and they got to the top. And not to say they would dismiss like deaths of teammates or anything, but they certainly, wouldn't have talked about being scared, definitely. So there might be this, and there's still a bit of, stigma to talking about in culture, talking about mental illness and things and those kinds of things, or loneliness. One of the things that's pretty common in climbing writing now, but would never have been talked about, decades ago, is the kind of this thing that happens when you live a high adrenaline lifestyle like that, where you have these really, really high highs, and then you go home. And what do you do for the next 6 months? Like, how will you ever come back to that level of excitement, right? And that's become a really common theme, I would say, with athletes at the top of their game in outdoor sports, that they're finally saying, oh yeah, like I have serious depression issues when I come home, right? So again, I don't think, very few cases that I can think of books, maybe before even 2010, that would have really tackled that head on. Like just a couple I can think of. But, so yeah, the climbing writing's definitely evolved. And so then the narrative shifts too, right? People have a different understanding.
Yeah, you're one of the ladies in the book, you were talking about she said that she's like that, where if she doesn't have a goal, she's almost like rudderless in life. And I actually not that I'm doing what she's doing, but I actually resonated with that like a ton. Like I do, I'll do, mine is kind of be more like endurance things. So I've like done a race, and then like, I sometimes find if I leave it too long, like now I don't want to use the word depression because it's probably too extreme for what I'm experiencing, but I do get a bit of a like,
Yeah.
in my whole life,
Yeah.
not just in the like training part of my life. And when she was saying that, like, I was like, well, actually, again, not on the same scale as her, but like, I was there, like, I definitely resonate with that.
Yeah, for sure. It's a pretty common theme. Even if you're, highly, highly successful, maybe even more so, yeah.
And then before I let you go here, because I'm conscious we're getting close to time.
Yeah.
The last question I was going to ask you is that with all the, the research and the hours and the time and the stories that you've looked into, is there one insight that you wish you could just like give to everyone or everyone knew without having to perhaps do all the time and effort that you've put into it?
Oh, God.
If there is one.
I don't know if there is one. There might be a few things. Like, what I hope people get from the book is, well, first of all, I hope they enjoy it, just straight up good stories. I hope they like it. But I also hope that they go away with this sort of sense, maybe like hopefully if all goes well, there's a bit of empowerment there where a young woman might read the book and be inspired and just maybe she's at a point in her life where she's not really sure if she could do something, and this might put her on the other side of that fence and allow her to feel confident. So I hope that happens. And really, one of the big things for me, and again, this is like showing my age a little bit, but I really, I don't want these stories to get lost, And so this is the way that I know to make sure that there's a bit of longevity and, maybe someone will use this book to research another one that they're trying to put together, or a thesis or something. And yeah, I just hope it's a valuable resource on kind of many levels, I hope.
Yeah, I definitely think it is, yeah. Because I think it's certainly a book that, as you said, you've had to condense so much history and so many people into like these kind of short articles. So I think definitely is one of those books where you read it, and while you have provided enough information to get a grasp of the story, you would definitely be like, if I was like a young girl who, say, was wanting to get into ice climbing, and I think Sarah was maybe one of the ice climbers,
yes, she is,
like reading her story and be like, and then, I mean, she may not have a lot of books. She's quite young. I think she's younger than me.
Yeah.
She's like 30.
No, Sarah's 50, but,
sorry.
But she hasn't written anything really about herself. Yeah. So there's a perfect example of someone who's done she's got a whole list of amazing accomplishments, achievements. And she may be kind of under the radar for particularly people who aren't necessarily in that really niche part of climbing, but yeah.
And I guess if I could squeeze in one last question, if there's one person that you wrote about that you weren't able to talk to during the research, whether they just probably passed away, who would it be and why?
Oh, who's not in the book?
No, who is in the book? Yeah.
Oh, there's a few actually. There's a Polish climber in the book called Wanda Rukiewicz, who would have loved to have met her and talked to her. She's a very interesting character. And Juko Tabe, who's the Japanese woman first ascended Everest, I met her actually here in Banff, at the White Museum a long time ago. But at the time, I knew who she was and I knew why she was famous and everything, but I just didn't have the courage to go and talk to her. So that hope might have been different now. I might have had a little more, self-confidence to probably approach her. But what's been really great is Lynn Hill, who's in the book. We've done a bunch of events together, and it's just been super fabulous to hang out with her and have her support. It's been really fun. And I never could have imagined that, because she's the reason I started to climb, actually. And so now to be kind of hanging out with her is kind of weird in the best of ways, but I could never have imagined that. Even 5 years ago, I would never have said to you, I'm going to go see if Lynn wants to have breakfast, or something, which now I would.
Yeah, it's really cool.
So it's interesting.
Well, look, Joanna, thank you so much for sitting down with me and giving me your time. The book's amazing. It's beautifully written and it is actually visually very beautiful as well. I think it's important that you've got people like yourself in the community who's actually highlighting not just these women, but the stories that they've had, and perhaps even if they're well known, some of the kind of lesser known stories. So thank you very much for doing that.
Yeah, thanks for the invite. It's been really good.